Hello, Austin Wintory here. And first off, before I say anything, my tremendous apologies for the fact that this is coming months and months later than I had originally anticipated. However, you've already gotten the email that I plan to roll this into this meaning the sort of master class style insight into the process and to questions about the composing side of games and or anything else that we want to talk about, et cetera, from the Sunset Kickstarter. I plan to roll this beyond Sunset into upcoming projects, and I have the Banner Saga 2, and I have Giant Squid's debut title, Absu, which I'm very, very excited about, and which is going to be more protected by confidentiality than the Banner Saga will be, but which is announced, and so therefore I should be able to share some things there. I'm also going to be working on a film later this year with a director that is one of my best friends in the world, and someone I've worked with on a couple of prior films. And so for anyone interested in film scoring, and especially the differences between game and film scoring, that could be a potentially fun opportunity to kind of look under the hood there, and basically just keep it going throughout the year, and allow it to be somewhat of a dialogue. I would love to host some Google Hangouts with 5 to 10 of you at a time, so that we can actually have proper real-time conversations that are hopefully full of questions inspired by the little bits that I leave here in these videos. So again, thank you so much for supporting this. Again, I am really sorry it took forever. As you saw in the email, which hopefully you all got without a problem, I had some personal life things colliding with work schedule through the whole second half of last year, 2014, that culminated in my father getting sort of out of nowhere diagnosed with cancer and ultimately dying in January of this year, which took an already sort of weird schedule as I was dealing with another friend in a medical crisis and put a huge tailspin on all of it. And so it took nothing short of those pretty unprecedented circumstances for me to let this time pass the way it did. So I apologize even in my acknowledgement that it was beyond my control, but I am very grateful for the compassion that you all have shown, and for the patience. No one's written to me saying, where's that thing I paid for, damn it? And in a way you would have been righteous in doing so, and so it really means a lot. So for this first video, I don't want it to be like an hour long, so I took all the initial questions that everyone sent, and I tried to kind of summarize them so that the most recurring questions I could address en masse, and then these videos can also have responses. Like, I'm going to put this, you're watching this right now on YouTube, even though it's an unlisted video, and so you can ask questions down below, and I will answer those in subsequent videos, unless it's something that makes more sense to answer in the comment, in which case I'll do that. And of course, you can always reach me on Twitter and Facebook, etc. So first question, here's how I wrote it, which I think summarized quite a few versions of the questions, which was, what is your music writing process like? And specific within that, questions of workflow, how I start, what the process is from there, general philosophies, do I have more than one process, etc., etc. How collaborative does it get? How much do I think about the logistics down the line, such as how or if it will be recorded by live musicians and that sort of thing. And so that seemed like a great one to really tackle for this first video, because it's a big question, of course. So basically the workflow is both simple. In the end, it's very simple. I don't have a sort of regimented protocol each time. And the reason for that, I have a little cheesy catchphrase, which is that I don't know when being in the groove, this is apparently my hand symbol for being in the groove. I don't know when being in the groove makes the invisible transition into being stuck in a rut, which feels very much the same as you are moving from one to the other. And so because for me, composing as a lifestyle, as a thing that I do with every day of my life and plan to for the rest of my life, involves the idea of exploration. To me, music is an expression, composing rather, is an expression of curiosity. And as such, doing the same thing over and over again would constitute a stagnation of that impulse. I will have lost the thing that makes me want to do this. And so I therefore try to make my process widely varied each and every time. So another way to phrase this is that the parameters of the compositional task at hand, I try to let dictate the process. I try to let dictate the process. That's the simplest way to put it. So sometimes I like to start by hand and just sketch out very basic ideas. And so I have a lot of these little sketch books like this. And so, just turning to a random page here. Like here's a movie I worked on last year called Dark Summer, which I think comes out this summer, actually. And so, here's just scratches of melodies and ideas. Just like little short form, sometimes it's a little melodic fragment, sometimes it's something almost like like a lead sheet, which just kind of like basic chords or suggestions of chords. Sometimes it's more elaborate than that, in which case I'll do, like just in a book like this, something that can be sort of sketched out a little bit more deeply. And sometimes I go straight into a more of a short form actual score sketching when I really want to feel, be old school. And this is from a movie I did a couple of years ago. I don't do this that often anymore, simply because you need to have a lot of time in order to write fully by hand that way, and then to somehow get it into the computer, because inevitably it needs to be in the computer for purposes of making mock-ups and or for preparing recording session materials, or even just to prepare if only to prepare final sheet music for a performance or a recording. You want to be using the tools there. So sometimes I start by improvising ideas. Sometimes I start by sketching something out and handing it to a musician to record, and then sort of reacting to their performance before I go any further, which obviously you can't do with like a full orchestra. But if it's, say, a cellist like Tina Guo, who I work with very often, who played all the cello solos in Journey, I'll sometimes just put something in front of her and see what happens, or one of maybe another dozen or so musicians that I work with on a really constant basis. And the idea being that it's because I'm letting the music sort of come out different ways each time. I react to the process of it coming out different ways, which then leads to novel ideas, which hopefully let the music stay fresh in some way. This is the hypothesis, if nothing else. And until I can sort of prove that it doesn't matter how much I vary it, it's always going to come out the same, then this is going to be how I do it. So in terms of the workflow, very often, I will start by constructing ideas in my sequencer. And so I use Digital Performer for that. And my setup is actually quite simple. And here, I'm going to just sort of show it to you. I'm just running, let me move here is Digital Performer, as you can see. Very nothing fancy going on there. And then I have a few other what we call slave computers. And for the composers and audio people, I apologize that this is all very redundant information to what you do. But as you can see, I have a couple of custom-built PC servers there sitting on the floor, in addition to the Mac Pro there. And those are all sort of networked together to host samples within my sequencer, Digital Performer. The reason why they're sitting on the floor and why there's cables everywhere and crap is because I have been, for the past year or so, in the process of pretty dramatically rebuilding my studio, and I'm actually going to commission a custom desk once I'm sure of some of the final details of that. And so for the time being, it's just kind of strewn about and is messy. And normally I'm much more of a neat freak than you would guess from looking at this setup. So I then, using the sequencer, will create a mock-up. And so, as an example, I have here the mock-up for sunset. And so, for example, hopefully this will play. Let's see if it will actually play. I made a quick adjustment before I started shooting this. But you can kind of hear. So there's my, so here you can see from this one piece of proper score in Sunset, I have my strings, very simple. This is actually a very minimal mock-up because I didn't really need to be very elaborate. So you can see that's nice and simple. And then I actually mixed it myself in Digital Performer. It looks like the video dropped for some reason, so there's going to be a weird hiccup 1 second ago. So I've just started a new recording. Fortunately, it dropped right as I got lost trying to properly queue up these tracks, but anyway, here's a brief snippet of playback of the final actual strings recorded in Eastern Europe and Macedonia, the same orchestra that recorded Journey and several other projects I've worked on. So, little taste, you'll hear that on the soundtrack album, which you'll all get, of course, very shortly. And so that just gives you kind of a sense of the basic setup. And I'm glossing over a whole bunch of stuff, and so please do feel free to ask questions if there's very specific things you want to know. I'm certainly happy, especially for composers, I'm happy to answer questions. Normally I regard these kinds of questions as boring, because I feel like they don't get to the heart of the artistry. These sorts of questions, an example of which is, what sort of samples do you use? What kinds of effects and plugins? And what are the specs on your computer? And all those kinds of things. Because ultimately those are not questions about art. They're not questions about motivation. They're not questions about the heart of what it is that we do. But they are actually legitimate questions for composers who are just starting out and learning, and I asked all those same questions when I was in that position. So when I do like a 1-hour talk in front of students where this is the only chance we get to really have a conversation, I don't like to talk about those kinds of things because I feel like any forum online could answer those. But in this case, because we're able to have many sessions of chats, do feel free to ask anything that seems very esoteric and technical, and probably if you're asking it, someone else will want to know. And then, I'll probably end up putting all these eventually publicly on YouTube. And so someone may, down the road, be glad you asked. Which is, again, why I want to answer them in subsequent videos as opposed to just purely in the comments, so that it's easier to answer them in a way that more people could potentially benefit from. So one of the other components of the question was the nature of collaboration in the process. And that varies a lot from one project to the next, but generally speaking, it's always very collaborative. I like it for it to be just maximally collaborative. I don't ever want it to feel like I am writing music for a game developer or filmmaker, or even an opera company or a conductor who's commissioned an orchestral work or a chamber ensemble, or anyone with whom I might be working or who might have hired me, should never feel like they bought a piece of music and I'm just handing it to them and saying, here's your piece of music, I hope you like it. I am much more interested, again, because I don't ever want to get stale as a composer, I am much more interested in writing something that exists at the crossroads of our instincts. Now, of course, I am the composer, and I'm not inviting the collaborator to sort of co-write with me. I mean, there have been exceptions to this, but generally speaking, I'm not really interested in that. To me, music, I just for some reason can't really function that way. It's not that I am opposed to collaborations. It's just that for whatever reason, it's almost never actually been something that I felt like I thrived in. All of which is, of course, a tangent that the collaborator, the filmmaker, the game developer, whatnot, they will have ideas about music, and they'll have ideas about music within their game or their film. And those ideas will inevitably be this kind of X factor, external influence to my own instincts, and the combination of them is something that will hopefully be really magical and also really just sort of different and novel, and something I would not have arrived at on my own. And so actually Sunset is a fantastic example of this, because the type of game that it is, where you wander around inside of an environment and the music is heard exclusively through the player choosing to put on vinyl records or turn on the radio that he or she finds, that creates a way of thinking about score and its relation to the player's experience that is radically different from most games. So already, even just knowing the game mechanics, never mind, for example, the fact that it takes place in 1972 and 1973, and therefore the music needs to be period relevant and period authentic. So never minding even that fact, and never minding within those constraints what Michal and Aurea, aka Tale of Tales, aesthetics and personal taste is, just my own awareness of the way the player is going to interact with the music is going to influence what I write and drive it away from, if I had just sat down and said, I want to write a piece of music today, what would I write? And to me, that is that collaborative element, even if it's collaborating with the medium itself and not with another human, like I said, incorporating the game mechanics into the thought process, is influencing what I do. So I can never overstate the impact that collaboration has on the creative process for me, and I love that about this job. That's one of the reasons why I do it. It's a feature of writing music for games, for films, etc., is the outside influence. If I wanted to be the sort of Charles Ives type, or even the Beethoven type, who kind of retreats into their private sanctuary and writes like a mad scientist, then that's all I would do. And I actually do that, but it represents very much the dwarfed minority of my overall compositional output. So the last part of it that I want to address here, before this gets too outrageously long, is how much do I think about the logistics of the music as I'm writing it. Particularly, will it be recorded live? How will it be recorded live, etc.? And my answer to that is, I think about that in a huge way. I do not sit down and write in this sort of radically open-minded, idealistic way and just let whatever comes out come out and then figure out how to afford it later. I nearly do that, but I don't actually fully do that, because I don't ever want to write something that then is just completely outside the realm of possibility to produce correctly. So if it's electronic music, for example, the only 100% electronic score that I've ever written was my first collaboration with that game company called Flow. Because that aesthetic was defined as an electronic one from the beginning, once I was within those parameters, then I didn't ever think about the logistics of production ever again. The only logistics I had to keep in mind were things like resource limitations on the PS3 when collaborating with Sony, in terms of what we could, how much music we could feasibly hold, and the number of simultaneous streams, and all of that sort of stuff. Which is, if you want to know more about that, then ask. But that's technical. I don't want to get too bogged down in the technical. And so, but in a case like Sunset, where I don't really know, I do just kind of start writing, but I also know that I'm working within a very tight budget, even with your collective generosity as Kickstarter backers. It's nonetheless a very tight budget. And so I know that generally the music is going to be featuring small groups of musicians and small groups of easily produced instruments. So guitar is the natural front runner for a game like this that takes place in the 70s in South America. There's going to be a prominent sort of folk tradition represented in the score from this fictional region. And so I also know that guitar is inexpensive to record large volumes of compared to, say, an orchestra. An hour of guitar music is not as much cost as an hour of full orchestral music, as is probably intuitively obvious. And so things like that I do definitely bear in mind. It varies dramatically from one project to the next, and what the final timeline of that project is going to be like. Like, I've worked on some things before that you've never heard about because they were proofs of concepts and demos that production companies were then using to kind of pitch publishers to get a budget, for example. And so I like, for example, earlier this year I worked on a project that was an Oculus-based game that I wrote orchestral music but did not record any of it because what I did is never going to be publicly released. It's just for being able to present the game as a playable build and as pitch materials to potential investors and things like that. Now, of course, that said, to any composers that are watching this and interested in potential career advice, that's actually uncommon for me to do. I will typically say we should even more essentially fully produce and record, etc., music written for that type of scenario, for the reason that when the producers are then going to pitch it, we want them to be able to put their best foot forward. You know, if they've asked me to write music for their pitch, that means that they most likely want to hire me to score the actual full production of the game once they raise the money that they're after. And how better to justify the full score budget than to spend some fraction of it on their small demo, or what's often what's called a vertical slice, where they are making kind of a quick tour of the various features they plan to create for the full game. You want that to be represented as honestly as possible. And so the music actually sounding right is something I often push for. And it's a way to actually get them to pony up more money later because they can actually see what it got them. And you're not just arguing an abstract, especially when you're early on and don't have sort of fully produced music necessarily in your reel because you haven't worked on as much stuff or things of the sufficient budget to produce it. So my advice is always to try to get that as early as possible for all those reasons. So that was a tangent, very specifically meant for any composers and for any sort of people that are just here for general thoughts. I apologize if that was overly esoteric. And I'm going to call it here, and I have a load more that I'm going to talk about in subsequent videos. Please do give me feedback on this, and hopefully it was interesting. And that's all I have to say for now. So thank you again for your support on this Kickstarter, and we'll talk soon.